Hello there, this is Yana for W+9, and thank you for joining me today. With spring being just around the corner, I find myself often reaching for floral stamp sets and watercolors. Today, I'd like to invite you to create several simple and quick watercolor cards for any occasion. I will be using W+9 Beautiful Bouquet Ranunculus stamp set as my floral image. This is a beautiful floral cluster that works great for many different occasions. Since I will be watercoloring, I have watercolor paper. This is Arches hot press and cold press watercolor paper panels cut to about 3 by 4.5 inches. The hot press watercolor paper is very smooth and is absolutely perfect for stamping that you plan to watercolor. It is almost as smooth as regular cardstock, but since it's watercolor paper, it is designed to take and absorb water, allowing you to create little watercolor masterpieces. And with this stamp set, the Ranunculus set, believe me, even if you're a beginner, you are set for success. I mentioned I also have a sheet of cold press watercolor paper. I simply didn't have enough hot press left, so I had to reach for whatever other kind of watercolor paper I had in my stash when I was filming this video, as I wanted to create more than one project. For my watercolors, I'm using Daniel Smith Extra Fine Watercolors. I have a sampler color chart here. The one I have here features 238 colors. Each color is added as a little dot onto the paper. Now, there's not a lot of watercolor here. There's definitely enough to try the color out and see whether you like it or not. And there's also enough watercolor in each dot to do simple coloring. I've had this chart for about a year now. I can't say that I use it very often, but I do reach for it almost every time I want to watercolor something, as I just happen to love the quality of these watercolors. What's great about this chart is you can test out the color, pick out the color you like, and later buy the color in a bigger tube, so that that color will last you much longer. But please don't feel like you have to use these particular watercolors. There are many great watercolor products out there. A lot of inks can also be used as watercolors, so use what you have on hand. I'm using these here as they happen to be one of my favorites. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm first going to heat emboss the Ranunculus bouquet onto my watercolor cardstock panel using gold embossing powder. I'm using my Mini Misty stamp positioner today to make sure I have perfect results. I'm not going to stamp this image in full onto every panel. I'm only going to create partial impressions and will try to vary them on every card I make. By doing so, I also want to show you different placement options for one image. I've treated my paper with an anti-static powder tool. This is a must-have as it eliminates the grease and oils from your fingers and just helps to keep your embossing nice and clean. And now I'm stamping my image using Versamark ink. This is clear, sticky ink that is designed for heat embossing. It remains wet longer, allowing you to add embossing powder to your image. I'm going to cover this with gold embossing powder. This is embossing powder from Hero Arts, and will heat set it using my heat tool. I created a partial corner impression, and you can place it so that the floral cluster is either at the top or at the bottom of your card. I actually intended to have this one at the bottom, but when I later went to stamp a sentiment, I forgot and stamped my sentiment so that the floral cluster ended up being at the top. Here I'm using this image again, and I'm stamping this onto another watercolor panel. This time I'm doing a partial impression on the side. I want to use this on a landscape card, so I'm stamping it on a longer side of my panel. Let's do some coloring now. There's absolutely nothing special, nothing fancy. All is pretty simple and easy. If you've never done watercoloring before, the best advice I can give you is don't be afraid to try, and also do not try to make it perfect. To me, watercolor is all about having little imperfections, all about having a few missed spots or colors bleeding one into another. It's a way of relaxing and enjoying the process, so do not stress. Just color and enjoy. I'm only going to use 4 colors today: green, teal, pink, and purple. And if you want to know the exact names of the colors I used, I will have them listed on the blog. I'm honestly having a hard time pronouncing some of them, so I'm not even going to try. The way I like to color is with a water brush. Because I'm coloring a small, detailed image, I'm using a small, detailed water brush. I love this particular water brush as it lets very little water out. It doesn't spill water, and thus it never ruins my coloring. The way I like to color is I like to pick up the pigment from the sheet and transfer it onto a palette. Here, I'm using a clear block as my palette. Notice I don't go directly to my image right after I pick up the color. I first bring it over to another surface where I can dilute it with water and make it less saturated, less vibrant. So you don't need to use 3 shades of green, 3 different colors of green to watercolor one leaf. I know this might sound like silly advice, but for the longest time, I didn't understand that, and I would always look for a pale color to add as my base color, and would then use a more vibrant saturated color to add shadows. You can certainly do that, but you can also dilute a vibrant ink color into a soft one and use it as a base color for your image. Next, I once again go to my watercolor, pick up some pigment with a water brush, again diluted with water, but this time with less water, and then bring it to my image to add shadows. If you look closely, you'll notice that the watercolor dot that I'm picking up color from is almost out of pigment. There's very little left. But since I'm coloring such a small image, there's still enough to do my coloring. Moving on to coloring the little berries. Here I'm using purple, and again I'm picking it up with my water brush, diluting with water on a clear block, coloring a base layer, and then adding highlights with a more saturated color. To color ranunculus themselves, I'm using pink. Again, I've picked up the color with my water brush, diluted it to make it much less vibrant, and painted a base layer. Next, I'm coming in with the same color, but it has been diluted with a little less water, and adding darker color to the sections that appear darker. I'm also going to add a little bit of color to the background around my flowers. Adding color to the background always helps images pop, and it helps to draw the eye to the focal point. Now, you don't have to use teal for this. You can go with any other color. I think peach would look beautiful, or very light gray would also work here. Once my coloring is done, I'm going to add a sentiment. Like I mentioned, these kinds of cards work for many different occasions. This can be a birthday card, a thank you card, a Mother's Day card, I miss you card, and so on. I use different sentiments from various W+9 stamp sets, and I have them listed on the blog if you'd like to know specific names. To use my watercolor piece on a card, I'm going to foam mount it onto a 4-bar white cards by Simmons' stamp. I feel like this is a great size for this particular floral image. Now, before I do that, I also want to add some stamping to the card base itself. I want it to appear as if the floral design is being continued from the watercolor panel onto the card base. So I've placed my 4-bar card base inside my MISTI. I added watercolor panel on top, I have it centered, and I placed the stamp set over it to make sure I have it perfectly aligned. I'm going to close the door of my MISTI, pick up the image, the stamp, remove my watercolor panel, and stamp the image using a very light gray ink onto the card base. This is Fairy Dust ink from W+9. It's not going to show up on photographs, but it is visible in real life, and I feel like it adds a really nice touch to this project. Next, I'm going to foam mount my panels onto the card base. I'm using purple fun foam as I'm all out of white at the moment. I've cut this fun foam smaller than my watercolor panel, so it's not going to be visible from the side unless looked at directly from the side. And even if the recipient will look at it and will see it, it actually matches in color to the purple berries I have watercolored, so it adds a nice little touch to the overall card design. I'm also going to adhere several gold beads from Pretty Pink Posh. I thought about adding sequins or little drops or something like that, but they all seemed a little too big for a card of this size, so I ended up going with beads instead. You can skip adding those, and I think these cards look beautiful as is without any additional embellishments. I mentioned I created 3 cards today. I did some stamping on the front of my card bases, on the back, and also stamped additional messages on the inside. So this finishes my cards for today. I really want to encourage you to pull out your outlined floral stamps, your watercolors, and do some watercoloring today. Have fun, play a little bit, and relax. Thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure to check out W+9 for more creative inspiration. I'll see you next time. Bye!